Welcome. I'm your host, Christina Haskin, and tonight we're talking about poetry. I went to the Darien Library to a poetry group, and tonight the guest I have is Madge McKeithen. She was the creator of the one-page poetry circle, and she's also written a wonderful book. Welcome, Madge. I'm glad you're here tonight, and I'm going to tell the audience a little bit about you. Madge McKeithen lived in the first 17 years of her life in North Carolina before going to the College of William and Mary and to the graduate school at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She returned to North Carolina to study and write in the Queens Low Residency MFA program. Her first book, Blue Peninsula, published by Farrow Straw and Garreau in 2006, is a book that tells in fragments of her turn to poetry in the wake of her older son's undiagnosed degenerative neurological disorder. Her work can also be read in the Lost and Found Stories from New York, a story about Paul Newman on 6th Avenue. Also an essay about going public at the library with her love of poetry forthcoming in Topograph, and the first chapter of a dark, true love story, Tri-Quarterly. Madge teaches at the New School and is a freelance writer and author. Welcome, Madge. It's
Thank
so great
you.
to see you. I really had fun at the group, and I wanted to talk about your book and also about your love of poetry. And did you always love poetry, or is it something that
I think I turned to it in an intense way with the illness of my son, in part because it was short and easily accessible and got to the point quickly and held a lot of deep passions and strong things that I needed. I can remember specifically being at Mayo Clinic with him, and we had been through tests and tests and tests, and he was sleeping, and there's through the little rabbit warren you can get over to the bookstore without having to go outside. At that time of year it was incredibly hot in Rochester, Minnesota. And looking through medical journals and every kind of thing for an hour and a half or so, and being ready to go back to the room and seeing the spine, blue and brown spine of Emily Dickinson on the shelf at the Barnes & Noble on the way out, and somehow I stayed a lot longer and found what I needed in that poetry, in that experience. And then that began something that kept going as we went to a lot of different places. And I think one of the things that drove me away from a lot of the medical literature was the lack of diagnosis for what was going on with him. And
the poetry helped you,
I think,
understand how to deal with it.
Well, I think it's an art form that can handle and contain so many multiple meanings, and can switch and change up as you reread. It handles is not the right word, but it contains ambiguity and not knowing and mystery and somehow fear, and a lot of just the strong emotions that needed a container so that the rest of the living and going through things could happen.
Well, I think too, yeah. I mean, sometimes poetry, because it's a right brain thing, it has mysterious qualities that you don't know why you react to it the way you do, and I think it can. It seems like in your book it's beautiful how you intersperse the poems and then your reaction to them, and then how it helped you deal with your son's illness.
Well, it was not an extremely intentional process, the writing of this book. I mean, I literally had
what happened?
Tons and tons of poems torn out of things, photocopied from things that I would carry with me, and then somebody said, "Oh, these are great. You ought to put it together in an anthology." But many of the poems don't explicitly say something about illness or even grief or sadness, and so then the suggestion came to me to try to put my son's story around, or the story of my dealing with his illness around the poems, and So the essays and the poems, and then the thing just sort of grew.
And you named it after the Emily Dickinson a part of her poem?
Well, the publisher who took the manuscript found the title. I had a very other and very depressing title. But I had put the Emily Dickinson, that poem and that essay at the back of the book. And he pulled it out and he said, this is about the blue peninsula of delight that you need to, or that one would want to risk going for amidst all the sadness. And he asked me, what did I think of that title? And I said, I think it's absolutely right, and it scares me to death. But yeah, no, he's the one who found that.
Well, it's a very moving book and very beautifully written. I mean,
thank you.
And you've gotten really good reviews. How does it feel now that it's out? Or
well, it's been a couple of years now,
yeah.
And I think the early time was the most sort of unsettling. And then it has, for me at least, been it's continued to keep me company through its, I read it differently at times. I don't go back and read it too much now, but I think it has kept me reading poetry, and then sort of was a mechanism for me to begin to read poetry with other people and suggest poetry, first to people who were going through difficult times, and then just to enjoy reading poetry together and with others.
I read too that there's a lifeline thing for people. Is there a website that if people did you start that?
No, I didn't start it, but the Academy of American Poets and Academy of American Poetry started the Lifeline Project in April of '06 as my book was coming out, and used my book as an example and invited people throughout the country, and that's continued now 5 years, for people writing in response and to verse. So a couple of paragraphs about their experience, and then a verse that launched that connection for them. And it's a wonder, and it's at that website, poets.org, and you can go and pull it up and read.
I'll have it at the
hundreds of them. Yeah,
that's a good resource for people. And I think, I've used poems or quotes or whatever I'm feeling different feelings, or I want to look for a particular feeling to help me strengthen something about myself. So I think it's a great way to connect to poetry besides listening to something or finding meaning about it. But how did you start this poetry circle?
Well, I guess when you ask what was the experience of the book coming out, there were a lot of changes in my life at the time, and empty nester, and then divorce, and then the book coming out. So there was both this exposure and solitude all sort of combined. And in the neighborhood where I lived on the Upper West Side, I was walking past the New York Public Library branch with my book in hand, contemplating my solitude, and I thought, there's got to be a connection here. And so I put together a proposal and went in and found a librarian who was open to the idea. It was just a wonderful synergy with her, and we sat down and spoke for about a half an hour, and followed it up with emails after that. And in a matter of months, we had launched. She's the one who came up with the name One Page Poetry Circle. Her dad had always, the businessman had said, anything worth knowing anything about ought to be introduced in one page. And she also thought it would be important that it be published poetry, so that we could encourage people to read in the library, and also to make it distinct from a poetry workshop where people might be bringing their own work. And so it was just a delight.